Some of you may not know that he was actually part of the very first workshop that created the College of the Atlantic. And after that, he went off and got his advanced degrees, taught for a while in the Midwest, and then he came back to COA and has been teaching for about a quarter of a century here, a mixture of political economics and more over the years, philosophy. And tonight he's going to be giving us a incredibly relevant talk specifically on looking at the COVID epidemic as an opportunity, as well as being the difficult times we're all in. And so he'll be giving us his insights into the practices of higher education as we move through these challenging times. And also, I'm hoping he'll give us some insights into, he's been doing extensive research the last couple of years on artificial intelligence and how that might tie into education as well. So without further ado, Ray Cox, it's all yours. Take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Yeah, so you guys can hear me okay? Okay, good. So let me put this into a slideshow format so you can see it. And say that I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wabanaki communities in this area who were Earth stewards of Abesa, or has other names as well, the Bar Harbor, the Clambake place where I grew up, actually, walking across the bar, living in Bar Harbor, and then got to take part in Ecology Atlantic for all these many years. And they also have been models in recent years for dialogue around Earth stewardship issues in many interesting ways at Nabizin and elsewhere. And I sort of want to hold that up, the kind of dialogue they've been trying to invite, because it's that concept of dialogue as a rich cross-cultural interchange is part of what I want to be talking about today, okay? But how do you do that kind of stuff in the age of the pandemic? Well, maybe the pandemic will be a portal to the future for us and give us experiments and ideas and resources from our traditions to draw on to get to a dramatically different kind of future, one in which we could really reinvent human ecology in higher education. And one of those resources would be Mr. Rogers, who is thought by many to be one of the greatest teachers of all time, and he did it all virtually. But he did it through slow but engaging dialogue. Welcome, neighbors, was a key part of his whole process. And I would like to hold him up as sort of a precursor of what I would call the slow Zoom movement, the effort to emulate the slow food movement, in which people try to take care in finding what nourishes their bodies in the way that they harvest food, process it, cook it, eat it together. We should be doing the same thing with the digital information that we're digesting and using to grow. The pandemic experience teaches us something really essential, which is that it's possible to have dramatic change at an unprecedented rate. To get everybody wearing masks, to get kids out of school and at home, to get people working from home at a distance, and to get the United States government to spend $2 trillion in the course of a couple weeks to solve what's viewed as a real problem. But where do we want to go, and how do we want to get there? Well, I might just say that when I think about these things, I get overexcited. And so I have to calm myself down. Maybe this will help you calm down. In any case, it's helpful for me if I get to sing a little song at the start. So I'm going to do that. I hope you'll bear with me. It's a song I wrote about slowing down and trying to get places. Oh, I'm gonna slow right down so I can get there sooner, yes. I'm gonna slow right down so I can get there today, yes. I'm gonna slow right down come to a full stop. Oh, maybe if I come to a full stop, I'm gonna get there right away. Yes. Well, in this talk, I'd like to talk about some steps towards defining human ecology, and then some big issues that I have to slow down that way for. Civilization, the big freaking problems, intelligence and higher education, how they're related. And then finally, artificial intelligence, understood as something that could be put towards a wiser Earth as an emerging feature of human ecology. And I hope to keep this quick enough so we can have some good time for dialogue. Part one, two initial ways to define human ecology. The first that COA started out from the beginning, that it's the study of the relationships between humans and their natural and social environments. We can sort of agree on that, even though what that means is sort of an essentially contested notion for many of us at COA. So we have to ask, okay, studying them, how? Well, one way to study relations between humans and their natural and social environment would be by learning to become an expert in some monological discipline like economics, for example, or managerial science, where you know more and more about less and less until you finally know, once you do your PhD, practically everything about almost nothing. And then you get to go out in the world, and if you're lucky, you get put in charge of something like running a motor company like the Ford Motor Company, or a war like the Vietnam War, or the World Bank, the way this guy, Robert McNamara, was. I would just comment that if any of you know the history of McNamara, the war in Vietnam and the World Bank under his leadership involved all sorts of problems, social, environmental. And I would suggest that it wasn't because he was a stupid guy. He was a very bright guy, one of the best and the brightest that the U.S. produced in his age. But it was a kind of disciplinary focus that he brought, a kind of blinders that disciplines provide. Consider the story of the blind men that were invited by an Indian king to come into his courtyard and examine an elephant and report what they found. And one said, "Oh, the elephant, he's very like a wall, large and flat." And another said, "No, he's very like a snake, long and windy." Another said, "No, he's big and solid and round like a tree." They were holding different parts of the elephant, right? The ears, like a big fan. And they argued with each other without realizing that they were each looking at a part rather than the whole. Disciplinary focuses tend to put blinders on us so that we just see a part of the elephant, as it were. And part of what human ecology is about is doing the opposite, learning to connect the dots. So,
sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
But I don't think your slides are advancing for some reason.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for telling me. Can you see them now? Wait a second.
Okay, we've now got two approaches to the study.
Okay.
We missed the elephant.
You missed the elephant. There's the elephant. Okay.
Thanks, sorry.
No, thank you very much, John. And maybe I'll just keep going this way with it in the format so we don't... Can you all read this okay? Okay, so the two approaches...
Yep.
Good, thanks, Ken. On the one hand, there's a sort of what we might call the professional, traditional liberal arts major approach that's very discipline-centered as a way of knowing the world and studying humans and their environment. It's theory-centered, it's discipline-centered, it's elitist or meritocratic. You know, the best and the brightest are the ones who are going to advance the most in the field and know the most. And its culture is centered in a Western tradition of national security states that are pursuing GMP for atomistic consumers. That's sort of what higher education in the US developed as in its dominant form in the 20th century. And in contrast, COA provided, along with other schools, provided a different kind of vision that was problem-centered, practical or action-oriented, a values-driven kind of education that included creative expression and cultural activity by people weren't neutral bystanders, but were involved participants. And human ecology also provides kind of interdisciplinary, non-departmental approaches. What that means is one of the essentially contested features is what's transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, but some way of trying to see the whole elephant through the different disciplines is an essential part of what human ecology is about, as well as seeking to include all the stakeholders, everyone affected in the issue, in authentic dialogue, in the study, and also in the decision-making and the cultural activities that are involved. And finally, human ecology includes a kind of holistic dialogue from points of view of all the cultures that are grounded in a kind of nonviolence and spirit-led mindful discernment, genuine dialogue between cultures, rather than imposing a Western vision of the kind you'd find in the World Bank, for example. So in this framework, you end up with a definition of human ecology as dialogical and spirit-led, in which it's the study and creative expression of the relations between humans and their natural and social environment in a problem-centered or life-centered way. It's interdisciplinary, that includes all the relevant stakeholders and their points of view in an authentic cultural dialogue in the processes of knowing, deciding, and cultural expression in a way that's community-based, grounded in loving nonviolence and communal discernment. Okay? So that's what I would propose as a kind of richer second kind of definition of human ecology. Now, in practicing it nowadays at COA, we're part of this U.S. Industry of education that faces some significant challenges. For instance, we have schools with tuition that most students can't easily afford, an industry that's heavily invested in campuses and luxury items that are designed to attract consumers rather than reach out to communities. We're in an environment in which knowledge is so readily available through the internet that in many respects, students don't need a college. The knowledge is out there. What they do need is to learn the abilities and skills and disciplines to access that in meaningful ways that advance their own learning and that also advance their motivation, their self-discipline, and their engagements with community, their connections to friends, to colleagues, to communities that they're going to work with. We're also in a situation where universities, I think, are starting to lose their grip on the credentialing process. Google and others are starting to credential people in novel ways. And if you can do the job, you can get the job is increasingly an important feature of the world that we're living in. Students also are getting increasingly skeptical about whether it's safe to attend school because of the virus, for example, and whether it's cost effective, whether it's worth all the money when they can go online and get information in other ways. So I want to suggest right here at the start some ways of enriching our conception of human ecology in our practice at COA that are coming out of the pandemic. And then I'm going to go on and provide some larger theoretical context for enriching our understanding of these ideas. But one thing is that I would suggest that it's really important to think of human ecology courses as students-centered, right? Not just centered on an individual student, but on groups of students, on colleagues who are working together. And finding ways for students to be working during the pandemic in the courses I've been doing and seen many other folks do, has required that we, on the one hand, draw on all the resources that are out there on the internet, but do it in a way that gets the students activated. It gets them to become the center of designing their own curriculum and their own learning and motivating themselves and evaluating themselves because they're spending so much time off wherever they are independently. So this idea that in each course we could invite students to sort of develop their own learning plan for a significant portion of the course and be pursuing that and coaching them in that so that the teacher no longer is the bank from which deposits are made into the student mind, but rather the teacher is a coach on the side, trying to help them. We're finding, I think, also new ways of thinking about education as place-based. In teaching learning languages on your own last spring, I had a student in Lebanon who was studying Arabic. It was a great experience for him, learning in a different place than where I was, and yet he could be collaborating with the class and learning all sorts of things. So I think we can have what I would call spatially distributed or translocal kinds of place-based education. And I think the pandemic has made us realize how possible that is, how rich the resources are for it. It doesn't mean that we should eliminate the college campus, or forget about it, but it's just that we're going to be able to enrich through multiple distributed spaces as part of the place-based education we do, and have people watching birds, in 18 different parts of the United States and comparing their notes on migration in an ornithology class. It's going to also be intersectional by features and by scales, that we increasingly the education can include people from different walks of life, different racial identities, gender identities, so intersectional in that very widely used sense, but also intersectional in that the intersections between very local and global kinds of activities are increasingly possible because we can, bring in a speaker from India, bring in somebody from Mexico, not just a speaker, but students to collaborate on a project in learning Spanish or in studying community-based security. It's that kind of opportunity also is making it possible to engage with more communities in more ways. So when students go off to do internships or residencies or senior projects, they can still be connected to COA and their colleagues at COA, their peers, as well as faculty. But they can also be building relationships for collaboration in India or in Italy or wherever they are. And a lot of times people talk about online classes as though they're sort of virtual, and there's this virtual reality you're in. But I would suggest that we should be thinking more in terms of, we're all in a place. Every student is in a place. All education is place-based in that sense, but it can be online enhanced, right? And the question is to figure out how you enhance what's going on in the places where people are. And I think it needs to be grounded in loving, nonviolent discernment that's spirit-led, which means that I think that people have to practice listening skills, practice forms of mindfulness, practice what I was suggesting earlier when I talked about slow zoom. Okay. So just in practical terms, here's some suggestions I sort of put out there as sort of hypotheses, what we might consider in dialogue about COA. What if we say, every course is a chance to develop an individualized learning plan and project? That should be a major part of every course. Maybe not every course, but most courses. Let's try it out. Or that every course is a course in epistemology and ways of knowing. In the ways of knowing of that particular discipline, what's the anthropology and sociology and the specific techniques of practice of somebody who's studying human anatomy? And how's that different from studying geology, right? And how's that different from doing anthropology, right? How do people write, communicate with each other when they're doing that kind of research, work with communities, and so on? And how can students learn that? Every course should be a course in mindfulness. And every course a hybrid that includes sort of slow zoom that would provide the opportunity for students who are in Lebanon or who are observing birds in Louisiana to take part in the course. Again, we don't insist that it would be every course. I'm just inviting us to consider in each case, why not? Let's experiment. That every course should be a part of an AI curriculum, sort of with AI across the curriculum model. And I'll say more about why that might be relevant later. And also why it would be relevant to think about a Wiser Earth curriculum as part of what we're doing. And then another idea we might think about is maybe COA should have a distance learning master's program where we have students come sometimes, but we might actually be able to build cohorts of students who can't come here, but who share common interests and could be collaborating together, even though they're in 2 or 3 different countries, and are taking part in our master's program. We should also be thinking about reincorporating alumni as part of the learning communities, as teacher students and as student teachers, not just by occasionally connecting them up with a student for an internship, but by maybe having projects that are an ongoing thing, like the kinds of projects that the Center for Applied Human Ecology or the food systems folks or other folks have been doing. And that we stop thinking of COA and higher education here just as something that happens during 4 years of a student's life, and it would think of it instead of as a function that happens as part of communities around the world throughout people's lives. And then I think we also need to be thinking about alternative funding models that are community-centered. And I'll have more to say about that later. Okay? So these are some practical ideas that I hope at the end we can come back to, and they might suggest some interesting topics. But I want to frame this whole way I'm talking about this in terms of some larger ideas. Okay? And so this brings me to part 2, where I want to talk about civilization and what I'll call the big freaking problems and their relationship to intelligence in higher ed. So among the other things that higher education institutions do, one is to provide research and training to increase the rationality and intelligence with which people govern their own lives and serve in social systems. So promoting rationality and intelligence of different kinds, which could include emotional intelligence, creative, musical intelligence, and so on. And in advancing rationality and intelligence in this broader sense, what kind of truth and what larger purpose should higher education serve? The dominant one in the 20th century in the US was to staff an economy producing ever more GDP. That was the larger goal, and has been, and continues to be. But here's an alternative: to nurture the growth of a community of ethical beings that develop right relationships with each other and the other creatures in their environment. I would suggest that something like that is what COA has been struggling for, and that we should, as a society, be aiming at. But now the question is, what conceptions of rationality or intelligence underlie these goals, these ways of thinking about the world? And I want to suggest there are 2 conceptions of intelligence. One monological, one dialogical, I'll say. To get at that, let me quote one of my favorite lines from Gandhi, where he said, "Civilization is not an incurable disease, but we should always remember that the English people are currently afflicted by it." What did he mean by that, What kind of civilization could be viewed as a disease? Well, let me start with a symptom of what I would characterize as this disease, which is at Harvard, with one of the best professors of philosophy and ethics in the US, Michael Sandel. His course on justice is taught, and you can see a videotape of it online. And he uses what we could call a dilemma-based kind of pedagogy in ethics. So there's a certain way of thinking rationally and intelligently about ethics that this approach embodies. And most people are familiar with it if they've seen The Good Place or other kinds of shows about ethics. In terms of the trolley car problem, the trolley is coming, it's going to kill 5 people, you can divert it and only kill 1, which should you choose? And most people end up choosing to kill just the one, or allow just the one to die, on largely utilitarian grounds. That's the way you would reduce suffering as best you can, or maximize net happiness. So in this course, Sandel sets up that issue, gets people to buy into a kind of utilitarian view, and then he poses another dilemma for them, where you've got a doctor, and she's got 5 patients in her ward that all need some kind of different transplant: kidney, lung, heart, so on. And they're going to die without it. And then in the waiting room, you've got a very healthy young adult who is napping. And Sandel's question is, well, on utilitarian grounds, shouldn't you sacrifice anesthetize the napping patient and sacrifice his organs to save the other 5? 5 for 1, right? In the video of this particular class session, you can see Sandel's kind of excited to see people get concerned about this, but then there's one kid in the back that raises his hand, and Sandel is just excited. He's thinking, wow, I've got a hardcore utilitarian, this is going to be fun. But the kid who raises his hand says, well, I wouldn't kill the healthy person. What I would do, though, is, sacrifice one of the 5 that's going to die anyway, to save the other 4. Maybe, ask for I don't know how to do it, but, that would be the basic idea. And when he makes that suggestion, that whole room I just showed you lights up with a kind of electric applause. People are so excited. Yes, this gets us out of the dilemma. Wow, what a great idea, they're thinking, right? So Sandel, as a polished professional teacher of ethics, lets the applause die down, and then he says, well, that's a good answer. That's a pretty good answer. Except for the fact that it ignores the whole point of the philosophical example. And he pauses, and then he just goes on to another topic, right? And for Sandel, the point of doing ethics and philosophy is to find some basic principle, like utilitarianism or a Kantian categorical imperative, from which you can deduce the correct ethical choice in any situation, right? So that's what he wants his students to focus on. This kind of reasoning where you start with some premises and you can arrive at the right conclusion. And you just have to find the right premises. But in real life, if we have somebody who can come up with creative solutions like that, that's what we want when we're in an ethical dilemma. We want someone to find a third way, to multiply their options, as a lot of people in conflict resolution would refer to it, right? And so what I want to suggest is that we'll come back to this as an example, but it illustrates a kind of reasoning that I think is problematic of our civilization and that Gandhi was talking about. Some further symptoms of the disease. The civilization that's globally dominant on our planet is structured by ways of reasoning in economics, governance, technology, and morality that threaten our species with some big freaking problems: ecological collapse, pervasive injustice and mutually assured destruction, domination perhaps by superhuman machine intelligence in the future, the relativist kind of annihilation of meaning for human life that springs from the fact that people can't decide whether Kantians or utilitarians or somebody else is right. They can't find the right starting points for their moral philosophy, and so they end up in relativism. A species that imposes such radical existential threats upon itself, what are they thinking? If an anthropologist from Alpha Centauri came, they'd wonder, what are these people doing, destroying their environment? This kind of species must have a problem that's rooted not simply in its environment, but in how it's thinking, the way it's thinking, right? So what I want to suggest is that the dominant form of thinking that takes variations in these different areas like economics goes back to Aristotle and is what we could call the monological tradition of algorithmic or inferential reasoning. And the basic model for it is one where you have an algorithmic rule, like the one for categorical syllogisms that says, in effect, if all A are B and C is A, then C is B, right? And you can apply that by putting sort of input in the form of premises to say all men are mortal, all A are B, and Socrates is a man, C is A, and then you run the algorithm and it gives you the output. Socrates is mortal, right? And this is the kind of reasoning where you start with premises, use algorithmic rules or inferential rules to arrive at a conclusion that was exemplified by Euclid and by Newton and by Bentham and Kant in the way they think about ethics. And that is, in a really important sense, monological. One person or one machine, if they have access to the premises and the algorithmic rules, can draw the conclusions, right? No need for discussion beyond. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that basic frame of thinking about rationality and intelligence, this monological kind of reasoning, is the kind that Newton exemplified. You have a few laws of motion and you can predict where a rocket will shoot and how fast it will fall or how far it will get. It's kind of rocket science intelligence. And in related versions, we find it in economics, politics, and elsewhere. So in economics, there's this notion of a rational economic man as somebody who can be modeled with sort of calculus to look at the ways in which he or she is maximizing their profit and utility. Similarly, in politics and economics, you get a version of that rational economic actor model being introduced with realpolitik, where nation states are governing themselves to sort of maximize their power over territory and resources. And in technology, you get a kind of instrumentalist approach to thinking about technology, in which you end up seeking smart algorithms that give you power over nature. And similarly, in morality, you get the kind of reasoning that we've already illustrated or referred to with Kant and Bentham. Okay. And the vision of the world that we end up with when we have the sort of rational economic man or realpolitik or these other models, versions of this monological rationality, is one in which we live in a culture of conflict, in the sense that conflict is viewed as essential to all our activities. You know, the sort of the core metaphor for life would be there's two islanders, there's one coconut, and they both want it. and they're looking for weapons if they need them to get it from the other, right? It's what people in social science would refer to as a simple production system with conflict over the joint product. And politics, economics, studies of sociology, religion, art, and so on, from this point of view, all end up just being about multiple kinds of coconuts and multiple kinds of people, but they all reduce in their essence to this kind of conflict-centered view of life. Now, what I want to do is suggest that there's another fundamental kind of metaphor, or set of metaphors that we can use, that give us a really different view of life, and of reasoning, and of ways of thinking about human ecology and AI. And the metaphor is birth. In the process of birth, there is struggle, there is pain, and there can be death. But what there is not is conflict. The mother is not there saying, "You little sucker, you know, I'm going to prove, I'm going to show you, I'm going to win." You know, there's nothing like that. It's a collaborative process, you know, in which the pregnant woman and the fetus and the midwives and family, whoever's gathered around, are all collaborating to try and help go through this process in which there's a kind of transformation. And the person who was a pregnant woman is now a mother. And the fetus is now a baby. And there's a new community and a set of relationships that have emerged through this kind of process of transformation. I want to suggest that dialogue is this kind of birthing process, as Socrates would have held. It's one in which we go through a process of transformation to arrive at agreements with each other, to establish new relationships. So in thinking about dialogical reasoning, I first note that it doesn't use algorithmic rules. It's instead guided by heuristic counsels or advices, things that you can try. They invite and suggest strategies of observation, discernment, search, creative invention. Instead of an inference from premises to a conclusion, like with Aristotle, you know, the reasoning process in dialogical reasoning starts with an encounter with others. There's more than one person, more than one point of view, more than one way of defining what the situation is. And they both pursue strategies of negotiation, problem solving in dialogue until they reach a genuine voluntary agreement. Okay, so instead of starting with assumptions and arriving at a conclusion, you start with a context, an encounter with the other, and you go through negotiation rather than inference per se, and you end up with agreement. Okay, and the heuristic strategies for that can include things like multiply your options, which we mentioned earlier with the doctor's case, but also things like focus on the interests behind the positions. If people don't agree, if they're insisting on their position, we'll ask, well, why do you want this? You know, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt with Anwar Sadat and others was won precisely because people started asking, well, why do you want the Sinai? What matters, right? Notice that each of these four that I put down here as examples of these heuristic strategies end with an exclamation mark. They give you a strategy to pursue. They don't give you a fixed output the way an algorithm would. Okay, there's been a lot of research on this kind of reasoning, and I've actually done some of it, including looking at Gandhi and getting the S and Quakers, and also trying to think about how to do it with computers, right? And that's where I want to be moving to. But let me just elaborate a little bit more by noting that probably the best single exemplar of a researcher on this, somebody who really kicked things off, was Gandhi, who developed this method of satyagraha that he referred to as clinging to truth or truth force, that involved a kind of loving sacrifice that can do three kinds of things. The kind of sacrifice, like getting beat up or arrested or what have you, that Gandhi and Martin Luther King and other people advocated as for social change, served really three important purposes. One is that it lets you discern the truth. If you thought you had a morally superior position, you had to ask yourself, am I willing to suffer and die for it? It's very helpful in the discernment process. Secondly, it helped to demonstrate it. If you are willing to do that, then your opponent, the person on the other side, in witnessing that kind of commitment, is given pause. And sometimes they're actually persuaded. Gandhi would put it, their heart could be melted. And then third, this process is one that could actually defend the truth. So by sitting in Nashville, people, the civil rights movement, were able to integrate the restaurants. In many cases, not because they changed people's hearts and minds, but because they persuaded the businessmen that they weren't going to make any money over this Easter unless they let people start, integrating. There was just too much disruption. Well, so this kind of methodology is one that Gandhi pursued in a kind of systematic way, and included what he referred to as Swaraj, which was sort of developing whole parallel systems for education, for food production, for clothing production, for healthcare, that were not based in the state, did not go back to the police to enforce any rules. They're all based on nonviolence and love as the sort of guiding ultimate sanction, rather than violence. And so you get an alternative vision of what a civilization might be like. So when Gandhi says civilization is a disease, he's got in mind what's in this middle column here, the kind of monological reasoning that's guiding ways people's practice economics and politics and so on. And in the last column, there's this kind of dialogical reasoning that he exemplifies, and then other folks doing conflict resolution have experimented with in lots of different ways, in which instead of being a rational economic man maximizing your utility, you think of yourself as a rational historical agent that's pursuing meaningful projects in the community. What you do with your resources is not determined by what will make you most happy, but what will produce the kinds of changes in the world that you really want to see, that you're committed to, for your children, for people you care about, and so on. And the model of politics and international relations uses, instead of using realpolitik, uses satyagraha and Swaraj to change the world and to govern it. And in technology, the idea is to use wise and sustainable relationships in the community through dialogue, rather than instrumentalist approaches to reasoning. And in morality, the claim is that there's a kind of experimental search for emergent objective truth through satyagraha, through clinging to truth, that can let people discover what the moral thing is to do in various situations. Obviously, all these things need to be talked about at considerably more length, but I just mentioned that we could come back to it. This is a page that sort of sketches in more detail what I would mean by, say, rational historical agent rather than economic man. So if people are interested in that, I'll be glad to come back to it. Because I want to just bring things to a close here with a short part 3 about artificial intelligence for a wiser Earth. What is AI? How's it relevant to all the stuff we've been talking about? Well, in a sense, AI is a technological project that's aimed at advancing rationality of the whole society, whole civilization, through what Max Tegmark has called Life 3.0, where the idea is Life 1.0 is sort of, organisms that, have hardwired into them certain kinds of behaviors. And evolution, selects for more intelligent or more appropriate kinds of behaviors in various senses. But then you get to a second level with animals that can learn during their lifetime, that have a kind of software that can be reprogrammed during their lifetime. They can learn where the rabbits are running or where the foxes are chasing. And then, and humans sort of take that to an extreme. We can do all kinds of reprogramming of our software. Been very successful at that. What Life 3.0 would be, and what the project of AI is writ large, is to develop entities that can reprogram both their hardware and their software. And it's being pursued as part of the larger political economic project that IBM has called the Smarter Planet. This is a vision in which our planet is an internet of things, and this internet pervades the world by instrumenting, by putting little monitoring devices on everything, the Hudson Valley River, food in the food chain, etc., and interconnecting it all through webs, and making those interconnections intelligent, governed by AI, and doing that for everything in our household, in our streets, in our educational system, in our food system, our weapons system, in the military, and so on. Okay, so that's the sort of Smarter Planet vision. And what kind of intelligence, what do we mean by intelligence when we talk about making all those things smarter or more intelligent? Well, I'll focus on the second. It should be, say, 4 here instead of 3. The last definition of intelligence here, that's especially relevant to where I want to get. More generally, we can say that intelligence is the ability to sustain and or enhance one or more values in various contexts over time. Okay. So there's smarter and less smart ways of doing things. And the smarter way is one that gets you where you want to go or does what you want to have done, that achieves the value that you're hoping for. That's the core idea of intelligence. And notice that in that very broad sense of intelligence, it's guided by values. It involves reshaping or adapting the self or the world in some way to reflect those values. So it's interactive if you're intelligent. It can take lots of forms: calculating a solution, writing a melody, making a piece of furniture, cooking. And in this sense, organisms and biological communities may exhibit intelligence. They have values. The oak tree wants to get some sunlight, so it sends out its tendrils in one direction rather than another. And we can speak of kind of natural intelligence in this sense, which does not require consciousness in the sense we're talking about here. And then finally, intelligence may be partial and limited, falling short of a wisdom that responds appropriately to the full range of values that we should hold in our life's context. So I want to really emphasize this contrast between partial intelligence, very limited, the kind that's being sought in the Smarter Planet, the kind that will maximize one or a few values like profit or production of soybeans per acre. And contrast that with wisdom, which would be defined as a systematic intelligence, or intelligences, that responds appropriately to the full range of values that we should hold in the context in which we live. In that sense, wisdom is human ecological, in the full sense of the phrases I've been developing. And most humans and human systems that are aiming at high levels of intelligence, in our society anyway, have been focused on a subset of the relevant values, often a very small subset. They're trying to be rocket scientists in whatever their field is. And they're often not very wise. They often leave out key values when they build that dam or redesign that whole school system or run that hospital. And a further key point is that wisdom requires fundamental humility, because it's always going to end up being partial, right? So we have to build that into the way we think about it. Artificial intelligence is, it's created by artifice, typically with silicon, but it doesn't have to be. Often, typically has a host machine, but it need not be. And it's traditionally programmed by a person or a team, but it doesn't have to be. Actually, artificial intelligence can be developed so that it's designed to use evolutionary processes to program itself. And that's what people often nowadays, when they say AI, they're thinking specifically of machine learning or connectionist models of deep reinforcement learning that involve this kind of evolutionary programming stuff. So a key question, I'm coming on the close here, as AI moves from narrow applications to, self-driving cars or whatever, to increasingly more general forms that approximate or perhaps even exceed at some point human levels of intelligence and human levels of control over our life systems. What kind of intelligence is going to dominate it? Is it going to be monological or dialogical? Will it be programmed with a kind of rocket science intelligence that promotes a smarter planet and that may leave us ending up with a kind of ship of fools run by, realpolitik, computers in the Pentagon, and rational economic man computers in Wall Street? Or will it practice dialogical forms of problem solving, negotiation, conflict transformation that may advance a truly wiser Earth? And if so, how? Okay. I just want to mention a couple tips for thinking about how we might do this, and then we can open it up for discussion. I think for cultivating dialogical wisdom in the sort of human AI systems that we're involved in, whether they're food systems or ways of managing the forests in the North Woods or what have you, climate, there are two basic strategies that I would emphasize to enrich the AI, beyond just sort of thinking, let's make it more dialogical in the way we program it. And one is to think of ways of embedding moral agents in the AI. Normally just to stick people in the decision-making process, in the calculation, the algorithmic flow of what's happening with the computer, right? So if somebody is running a police dispatch system with a computer, right, and they're trying to decide it most efficiently where to send cars in Miami, right? There should be ways of flagging and inserting humans at key points where some kind of key decision might need to be made that raises moral issues that require dialogue, where somebody might join in the phone call, right? Or join in talking, negotiating with the police that are being sent to the site, and ask them to consider, calling in a counselor instead of somebody with a pistol, right? So inserting moral agents in the AI process is one basic model. And the other is to find ways of embodying AI in the moral context of the social and natural life systems, to get the AI to actually be not like an absentee landlord, but like, a landlord who's part of the community. And there are all sorts of ways in which we found that, absentee landlords can operate in very immoral ways. But if they are in a community that increases the extent to which the consequences of their actions come back to them, and they get committed to the community in various ways. And so looking for ways to do that will not only enrich the perceptions and information flow and stuff of the AI, but also could, as it starts to approach something like human kinds of intelligence, get it to be committed in human ways to human community and the dialogue that could lead to a wiser Earth. So again, the pandemic experience teaches us something essential. It's possible to have dramatic change at an unprecedented rate. And to be honest, the development of AI right now is doing the same thing. It is just gushing forth. And I think that we at COA really need to be looking at how all the work that we're doing is connected to really transformative kinds of technologies that are being put out there and are growing in exponential ways. In Elise Boulding's phrase, we should be imaging a dramatically better world and seeking to start living in it now through practicing spirit-led, nonviolent, dialogical human ecology that interconnects humans and natural and artificial intelligences in the pursuit of a wiser Earth. And I would like to invite you guys for questions and comments. And this is the list that I had earlier of kind of some specific things we might be doing at COA. Maybe I'll copy and paste that into the chat, and then we can put the screen down, okay? And with that, John, maybe you can help me figure out who's in line to ask questions and encourage people to put stuff in chat and so on.
Great, that was brilliant. And I would love to hear from the audience. I've certainly got lots and lots of questions, but I'd love the audience to jump right on in and ask some of those questions for yourselves. So have at it. And you can either unmute yourselves and talk, or you can stick it in the chat and I can read your question that way, whichever suits you better. Great. I've got a question for you right off the bat, just to start the first part of your talk. One of the things that I heard an awful lot of in the spring from COA students, and I've also been seeing a lot of in some of the listservs that I'm on in higher education, is that the Zoomiverse has produced unprecedented amounts of depression and disengagement, both on the part of faculty and students. So this is sort of the dark side of some of the things we're advocating.
Yeah.
That we had hoped that by going online, we opened the world to the class and the class to the world. But there's something that's missing, and students are expressing some real reservations and real health concerns about this, and that this is also being shown by faculty. So faculty after faculty member talking about being exhausted, student after student is talking about being depressed. What's missing? What can we add to correct that if this is indeed the wave of the future?
So that's a great question. And I guess I would start by responding that I don't think that we want to, I think that human contact, that being in the woods with people is really an important thing to be doing, you know? So I don't think that we could substitute field trips on MDI forever with field trips to some Disney World virtual forest, right? Okay. But I think that there are ways in which we can, you know, you could have students visit Costa Rica or Tierra del Fuego or other places as virtual accompaniments to other students who are down there doing internships or residencies, or other colleagues who are down there, and they could get a lot out of it. And the question is, how do we draw on what's most helpful with the medium of Zoom, for example, and other kinds of online devices? And I think that it's really important to take this idea of slow Zoom seriously, right? And be not just assume that, well, because we're looking at a screen, that we're distant from each other. There are ways in which, for me, in my class in the spring, for example, learning languages on your own, the experience of being with my students was more intimate than it was in many ways in the Davis seminar room, because in the Davis seminar room, there's always a number of students who are sitting along the side of the table whose faces I can't see. And I try to get people to move around so I can see everybody's face, but it's always a struggle, you know? Whereas there's a way in which if people have their camera turned on, then I can see their face, right? And there's kinds of expression that in some ways can be even more intimate. One of the features that I noticed when I was meeting one-on-one with students, as well as in class, is that they would often be in their room or their home or some outdoor site that they liked. And I got to learn about them from what I saw in their room or what else was in the background. We could even talk about it. And doing that kind of talk, that kind of interaction, where you're socializing about the experience and where you are and where we are and so on, is part of what is, to me, parallel to the slow food movement, where people, you know, they don't just say, okay, we're gonna eat at 5, we'll be done by 5:35, you know, when you get in there, we're gonna start, and boom, 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 we'll be as efficient as possible. That kind of efficiency actually makes for poor digestion of food and a lack of awareness of who's producing the food. And the same can be true of Zoom. So trying to make it a more social activity, one that allows room for sort of poetry, song, mindfulness activities. One of my favorite activities in this last spring that I did was something I refer to as mindful gazing, right? Where you just sort of look around for 30 seconds or so on the screen and kind of hold each other in the light or in a good thought for people, and invite everybody to sort of turn their cameras on, so you can do that. And there are a lot of things like that that you can experiment with. And it seems to me that's going to be part of what's involved in adapting to Zoom. I do think that that it's really difficult to do large classes. I think I think that the class I did this spring and again this fall were ones where I could set up to meet with people at least once every other week. In the spring, I was meeting with them every week individually, and that really helped. And in both cases, I had them develop learning plans for what they wanted to learn. And I was sort of, when I meet with them one-on-one, we were sort of coaching them through it. And I found that created a kind of meaningful motivational structure and plan of action that made them, my experience was that they didn't feel as lost. They felt like they knew what they were doing. They were going somewhere with their learning. So that that sort of countered some of the kinds of frustrations, disorientations, and other things that people experience in Zoom in the spring and fall. I think one of the biggest challenges for me still is to find ways to generate spontaneous interactions. One of the real advantages of being all in one place, like COA, is you can bump into people going across, by the birch trees between turrets and take a break. And, oh, hi, and just start blabbing, and suddenly you're saying something interesting and it's connected to your senior project or my research or something else, And that kind of spontaneous synergy is really hard to generate when people are not physically bumping into each other. So finding ways to do that, I think, is still a really important kind of thing. There's some applications that try to do it, one called Donut, for example. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm interested in trying to do those kinds of things. I think Blake's been trying to do some experiments with that kind of stuff with the CST, Creative Structured Time, at COA. I also do think that there are physical problems or challenges in being on screen for long periods of time. And so figuring out ways to use the telephone instead, to go for walks. When I'm often in a faculty meeting, I'm out walking up Cadillac Mountain. And I've got the phone there and I'm listening, I won't do it if I need to be looking at documents, but if I don't, I can do that. It's, I think it's an ongoing experiment. John, I don't know if that's helpful, but I think, I guess the one other comment I would make is one of my most formative experiences in doing mindfulness work was with Thich Nhat Hanh's community, Plum Village in the southwest of France. And this was almost 20 years ago. And they have techniques for being mindful of brushing your teeth and driving your car and all kinds of stuff. But at least at that time, they didn't let any of the novices go online. And in fact, even the sort of younger monks didn't go online. It was just the really most experienced monks, because they viewed going online as probably the single most challenging environment in which to be mindful. So I think we've been making progress in learning ways to do it, but it is a big challenge. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience?
Ken.
I will defer. If there's some students who want to ask questions, Greg, you and I have talked about some of these things before, and this reminds me of past conversations. But if there isn't anybody jumping in, I do have a question for you.
Okay.
And I guess this probably relates a little bit to artificial intelligence. And the enthusiasm with which you embrace it, I sometimes envy. In part, maybe because I'm a Luddite, but also for the reasons that you may remember a parable that John Visvader used to tell about the peasant. Well, actually, I don't know if he's a peasant. He's probably a philosopher, or maybe the same thing. Working in the field, when the guy comes along and said, he's hauling buckets of water up to water his field, and the scientist, perhaps that's not what he was, but the modern day scientist comes along and says there's a technology for that. There's a well sweep that will do that. It's much more efficient. It's better for you. You won't waste your time doing this. And, the peasant says, I know about that, but I choose not to use it. because the danger of, and seeing Eric Johnson here, this may give him some insight into why I come into his office so often, is that working with the machinery, with that technology, you actually develop a machine heart, that the things that you do as a person, your efforts, your thoughts, your intentions, instead of being focused on the tasks that you have, become focused on the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Which is one of the reasons why I resisted a cell phone for so long. And despite all of its convenience, I actually think there's some truth to that. That by being dependent on that technology, whether it's Zoom or whether it's AI, that in fact, you spend a lot more of your life and your soul focused on getting the technology to work instead of working on the relationships or learning or teaching or other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if those questions ever dampen your enthusiasm or plague your thinking about, embracing technology.
Yeah, well, so the short answer is yes, absolutely. Okay, but I have a lot more to say about it, actually. I think, when I first started looking at this AI stuff, and what really got me interested in it was how horrified I was that these systems that might be comparable to humans in their intelligence or beyond and would be in control of our world. I just found that profoundly disturbing. And to be honest, I still do. I find it profoundly, profoundly disturbing. And I find it profoundly disturbing really in two very distinct but important ways to distinguish, though they're related. One is, there's this threat. I don't think the Terminator image of, Arnold Schwarzenegger coming or something like that is all that realistic a vision. But I do think that the idea that there could be artificial intelligences that may be quite different in the kind of intelligence they exhibit, but that they acquire control over the Northeast power grid, over Google, over, lots of different, our food system, our education system, and so on, and that they could become smarter than humans and sort of take over running things and decide, well, maybe you don't need so many humans for so much stuff. That's I think that's a concern that's so serious that it's worth thinking about, even if the probability of it is lower. So I think there's that. But on the other hand, I think that there's a reality that we're in now, and we have been for a while, in which increasingly larger parts of our society, our school systems, our food systems, our judicial systems, our national security defense systems, all this, our health care system is being run by AI. I went to the doctor the other day, and he was explaining to me what he was going to prescribe, and he said, well, this is what it'll let me do. Right? The machine was telling him what he could prescribe for what I was in there for, right? It's just a fact of our life. And I would submit that the forms of intelligence that have been modeled, that have been emulated by the people designing all those systems, are these ones that are in that monological tradition I described. And they are setting us up for having not a smarter planet, but what I would call the ship of fools. Somebody can be really smart and be a fool, not be wise, right? And I think that the way we're setting up our food system internationally, the way we produce and control and distribute water, all those things are just being run by fools. Really. So to me, it's really important to say, well, okay, what can we do about that, right? And my answer is, well, part of me would love to just go back, to wind the clock back and to say, stop the AI, back in when it could play chess and couldn't play Go or something like that, right? But that's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. There are too many big corporations and big militaries that are invested in this. So to me, to have hope for the future, I have to say, well, we have to figure out a way to create a different form of AI. So this whole dialogical model that I've been talking about is not only for me a model of the way we should live, and that grows out of the Gandhian, Quaker, and other traditions that I admire and emulate and think are sustainable and resilient ways for humans to interact, but it's also a model for how we could have, ethical AI creating a wiser planet, wiser Earth. So I'm sort of an enthusiast to try and get people interested in that and to think about how we could do it, partly because I'm so desperate. It really comes out of profound desperation. And then just further, in terms of your point about the machinery having a soul and so on, I think I have physical reactions sometimes when if I've been doing too much Zoom, and I just see my eyeballs start to get these little pulsating dots of white light that are kind of flashing at me. It's like, ah, so there's that stuff going on. And and then also there's a pace, which stuff happens. Like with email, you click and you send something, and there it is again. And I wasn't ready for that emotionally, And one of the things that's occurred to me is that I think that our current versions of this technology just don't operate at the pace that's appropriate for humans. And so, but I think that's a design issue. I don't think that's inevitable. I think that we could have computers that could let us breathe. Maybe even breathe with us. Maybe even invite us to take a breath. I have sleep apnea, and so I have a machine that's helping me breathe at night when I'm asleep. I'm not real happy with that, but currently it seems to be helping. But so I think there are ways in which machines can do that very mechanically, and in a way that's not so good. But on the other hand, they could also, to the extent, I think we could start to design ones that were more humane, more sensitive to cues. If you had a breathing machine that you were carrying around and you're going on a hike up Cadillac Mountain, maybe it could change its pace and operate in ways that would be where you'd say, hey, thanks for the help, buddy, kind of. So anyway, trying to find technology that's like that, that's more human. Because I think really from the beginning of technological inventions like fire, people have had the response you've had, Why do we want to, we were so happy eating those fruits and nuts, and nobody got burned. Nobody had to smell that horrible smoke. Nobody was in the cave getting who knows what kind of, chemicals in their system and we didn't have the term cancer then, but probably we were getting cancer from it if we lived long enough, And but people figured out how to domesticate fire and other kinds of tools, and I think that's what we have to sort of try and figure out with AI.
Right, that's a great response, and there's so many things that it'd be lovely to talk more about. I'm just being very self-conscious though about the time, and I know that some students have to run off to dinner, and there are other classes that are coming down the pike. So if there's one more short question people have got, toss it out. Otherwise, I think we'll have to just try and catch Gray around the place and on the Zoomverse.
I would be delighted to talk with people later too, at any point about any of this stuff. And John, I'm going to share a PDF of my PowerPoint.
That would be lovely.
And I tried recording the audio with my phone. I don't know if it will do that, but I don't know if people would be interested in that or not. But I might look at it and see, and if it looks like it might be useful, I'll send you a copy of that too to share. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, if there are no final questions, thank you so much, Gray, for this really interesting talk and conversation. And I'm really looking forward to discussing these ideas with you in the future. Folks, next week we've got Sarah Hall coming in to talk about her research on water quality and arsenic in the Mount Desert Island water systems. So we'll just keep on going for the rest of the term with COA faculty, and we do have one alum who will be coming in at the very end to talk about their work on paleoecology. But great, thank you so very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time. And like I said, this has given me an awful lot to think about.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg.
Okay. Yep. Okay. See you. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Bill Carpenter. Bill, are you there? Bill? The ghost of Bill Carpenter. Bill, are you there? I could hear you if you took your mic off. Mute. No, okay. Well, so much for that. Okay. Leave meeting.